The railway car stood in silent reproach under the November rain of 1918. Its gleaming wooden panels mirrored the pale faces of German delegates gathered to relinquish their empires. Ferdinand Foch, Marshal of France, observed with frigid satisfaction as these representatives approached the same carriage where their predecessors had celebrated victory 47 years prior. At that moment, as the ink dried on the armistice ending the Great War, the roots of a future and more dreadful conflict began to settle in the bitter soil of humiliation. Meanwhile, miles away in a hospital, a temporarily blinded Austrian corporal named Adolf Hitler shed tears of rage upon learning of his homeland's surrender. Poison gas had damaged his eyes during the war's final offensive, leaving him helpless in darkness. But his mind was ablaze with visions of revenge that would engulf the world 21 years later. This unknown soldier would one day find himself victorious in the same forest clearing, watching as French generals signed their nation's capitulation in that identical railway car. A moment of reprisal that would crown one of history's most destructive military campaigns. The peace conference in Paris during the winter of 1919 brought the victorious Allies together, intent on ensuring that Germany could never again threaten European stability. David Lloyd George of Britain, Georges Clemenceau of France, and Woodrow Wilson of America congregated around tables heavy with maps that would reshape the continent's borders. They crafted the Treaty of Versailles, a document that would deprive Germany of territory, military strength, and national pride, burdening the defeated nation with reparations so immense that they would hinder economic recovery for generations. Article 231, the notorious War Guilt Clause, compelled the nascent German Republic to bear complete responsibility for the war's destruction. This paragraph would ignite a rallying cry for German politicians who vowed to restore national dignity. The treaty's authors mistakenly believed they were establishing lasting peace through systematic dismantling of their former enemy. Instead, they forged chains of resentment that would pull Europe back into the abyss of all-out war. The reparations imposed on Germany were colossal, revealing the Allies' intent to crush any future German aggression. The London payment schedule, finalized in 1921, required the nation to transfer a wealth equivalent to 3 times its entire gross national product. Gold, machinery, livestock, and intellectual property flowed westward, creating a constant stream of compensation for the victors and ensuring recovery remained unattainable for decades. Economic collapse followed with certainty. By 1923, hyperinflation rendered the once proud German mark worthless. Citizens resorted to using barrels of currency to buy single loaves of bread, as life savings accumulated over generations evaporated overnight. Middle-class families who supported the previous order were plunged into poverty, their faith in democracy shattered by an economic calamity that seemed to affirm the harshest critiques of capitalism. Amid this chaos, politicians appeared with simple solutions for complex issues. Benito Mussolini had already showcased the allure of such rhetoric when he marched on Rome in October 1922, transforming from a failed socialist journalist into the leader of a revolutionary movement promising to revive Italy's greatness through violent means. King Victor Emmanuel III, presented with the choice of civil war or compromise, granted power to this former schoolteacher who had morphed into the embodiment of a revitalized Italian spirit. Mussolini's success provided a model for ambitious men across Europe to study and adapt to their own contexts. The fusion of paramilitary organization, dramatic propaganda, and pledges to overhaul the existing order while restoring national glory captivated populations still reeling from war and economic hardship. Leaders who offered slow reforms seemed woefully inadequate compared to revolutionaries offering immediate transformation through organized force. Munich's beer halls served as the backdrop for Hitler's political debut during his failed beer hall putsch in November 1923. The future dictator, still a little-known agitator with grand aspirations, thought he could seize control of Bavaria and march on Berlin like Mussolini had taken Rome. Instead, his amateur plot unraveled when police opened fire on his supporters outside the Bürgerbräu Keller, resulting in the deaths of 16 Nazis and forcing their leader to flee in fear. This humiliating failure could have derailed his political career, but German justice proved lenient towards those who claimed patriotic intentions for their actions. During his comfortable confinement at Landsberg Fortress, prison became Hitler's university. He dictated the initial volume of Mein Kampf to his devoted follower Rudolf Hess. This sprawling manifesto fused personal grievances with an ideology of racial hatred and territorial expansion that would shape Nazi policy for the following 25 years. Although its dense prose and extremist ideas initially drew little interest, the core message would eventually resonate with millions of Germans feeling betrayed by democratic politicians and demoralized by foreign occupation. When the global economic crisis began with the collapse of Wall Street in October 1929, it transformed European politics, destroying faith in liberal democracy across the continent. Unemployment surged past 6 million in Germany alone, while bank failures obliterated the savings of those who had managed to rebuild their lives post-hyperinflation crisis. Frustrated voters turned to extremist parties promising radical solutions to problems moderate politicians seemed powerless to address. Parliamentary democracy, which had appeared to offer hope for peaceful progress during the brief prosperity of the mid-1920s, exposed its weaknesses in the face of economic turmoil and political division. The frequency of coalition government collapses became bewildering, as competing parties failed to find common ground to address unemployment and social unrest. Street battles between communist paramilitaries and Nazi stormtroopers transformed major cities into war zones, where disputes were settled through violence rather than debate. Heinrich Brüning, appointed chancellor in March 1930, attempted to govern using emergency decrees that bypassed the paralyzed Reichstag. His deflationary strategies, designed to display fiscal responsibility to foreign creditors, exacerbated Germany's economic woes while granting ammunition to extremist critics who contended that democratic leaders prioritized international opinion over German suffering. Each new austerity measure validated Nazi propaganda portraying the Weimar Republic as a puppet regime serving foreign interests rather than the desires of its people. Franz von Papen replaced Brüning in May 1932, representing conservative politicians who thought they could leverage Hitler's popularity while controlling his radical impulses. This reckless miscalculation demonstrated the dangerous hubris of traditional elites, underestimating the revolutionary potential of the Nazi movement. When President Hindenburg appointed Hitler as Chancellor on January 30, 1933, Papen confidently assured concerned observers that the former corporal would be overshadowed by seasoned politicians who grasped how the system functioned. However, within months, those assumptions proved catastrophically flawed. The Reichstag fire on February 27, 1933, offered Hitler the pretext to suspend civil liberties and detain political rivals. Whether the Nazis ignited the blaze remains debated. Yet Hitler's response revealed his adeptness at manipulating crises. Emergency decrees eliminated constitutional safeguards, while stormtroopers dragged communists and socialists from their homes in the dead of night. Democracy met its demise not through foreign invasion, but through the systemic exploitation of its own institutions by those sworn to protect them. The Enabling Act of March 1933 completed the legal overhaul, transitioning Germany from parliamentary democracy to totalitarian dictatorship. Under pressure from violence and misled by false promises of moderation, enough Reichstag members voted to grant Hitler dictatorial powers for 4 years. Only the Social Democrats bravely opposed this self-destruction of parliamentary governance, achieving futile adulation from future generations while sealing their own fate. Before long, their party was banned and its leaders imprisoned or exiled. International responses to these rapid shifts revealed the dangerous complacency of democratic leaders who believed Hitler might be contained via conventional diplomatic channels. Many foreign observers initially embraced the end of political instability in Germany, finding a stable, even authoritarian, government easier to manage than the constantly fluctuating coalitions characteristic of the Weimar era. This misguided optimism blinded them to the revolutionary essence of the Nazi regime, which stood fundamentally at odds with the existing international order. Military rearmament started immediately post-Hitler's consolidation of power, though this was initially concealed through clever accounting and clandestine initiatives violating the Versailles Treaty's stipulations. The 1st Panzer Divisions emerged from training exercises disguised as agricultural programs, while the Luftwaffe materialized from civilian aviation clubs largely populated by ex-military pilots. By 1935, Hitler felt confident enough to openly reject the military clauses of the treaty, announcing conscription and revealing the secret growth of an air force that had been expanding for 2 years. The Rhineland's remilitarization in March 1936 marked Hitler's initial direct challenge to the post-war settlement, testing whether France and Britain would uphold their treaty obligations. German forces crossed the Rhine bridges one Saturday morning, taking advantage of weekend distractions among European governments, and occupying the demilitarized zone under orders to withdraw immediately if Allied forces came into view. Hitler's gamble paid off entirely when no resistance arose, demonstrating to him that democratic leaders lacked the resolve to confront aggression before it escalated. French Premier Albert Sarraut exemplified the paralysis afflicting democratic governments faced with authoritarian challenges that stopped short of outright attack. Despite commanding military forces far greater than the nominal German contingents in the Rhineland, he hesitated to act without British backing, which never materialized. This hesitation established a pattern of missed opportunities characterizing the Western responses to Nazi expansion throughout the 1930s, with each failure to act making future challenges even harder to confront. Appeasement emerged as Britain's official policy under Neville Chamberlain, who became Prime Minister in May 1937, convinced that reasonable men could resolve disputes through patient negotiation. His umbrella became a symbol of a strategy that confused weakness with statesmanship, viewing Hitler as a typical politician whose demands could be appeased through territorial concessions rather than recognizing him as a revolutionary intent on total overthrow of the existing order. This fundamental miscalculation would carry significant consequences far beyond the crisis it intended to avert. The Spanish Civil War served as a testing ground, wherein new weapons and tactics were refined ahead of the larger conflict. When Francisco Franco initiated his rebellion against the Spanish Republic in July 1936, Hitler and Mussolini seized the chance to support a fellow fascist while acquiring valuable combat experience for their forces. The bombing of Guernica in April 1937 introduced the world to the terror-induced weaponry that would soon wreak havoc on cities across Europe, while revealing the international community's incapacity to intervene effectively and prevent this harbinger of catastrophe. Soviet involvement in Spain created hazardous precedents, enabling political collaboration that would eventually facilitate the Nazi-Soviet pact. Stalin's choice to back the Republic while simultaneously purging Spanish communists who defied Moscow's directives showcased the cynical opportunism characterizing his approach to foreign relations. Western intelligence agencies observed with alarm how seamlessly fascist and communist dictators could collaborate when it served their shared interests, despite their claimed ideological irreconcilability. Anschluss with Austria in March 1938 was accomplished through internal pressure and external coercion. What peace treaties from 1919 had expressly forbidden was now happening. Austrian Chancellor Kurt von Schuschnigg soon found himself isolated when Hitler demanded the appointment of Nazi ministers to key positions within his government. When Schuschnigg proposed a plebiscite on Austrian independence, Hitler mobilized the Wehrmacht and crossed the border on March 12, annexing his homeland without firing a shot. Enthusiastic crowds in Vienna welcomed the German troops, validating Nazi assertions that they were liberating ethnic Germans instead of subjugating foreign territory. The Sudetenland crisis brought Europe to the brink of war. In the tense months of 1938, with Hitler demanding the annexation of Czechoslovakia's border regions, where ethnic Germans constituted local majorities, Konrad Henlein, leader of the Sudeten German Party, orchestrated provocations to justify German intervention. While the Prague government struggled to uphold order in regions systematically destabilized by Nazi agents, President Edvard Beneš was caught between surrender and conflict, which Britain and France appeared resolved to avoid. The Munich Conference of September 29, 1938, yielded an agreement that would forever symbolize the futility of appeasing totalitarian aggression. Chamberlain, believing he was preventing a European war through reasonable compromise, pressured Czechoslovakia, alongside Mussolini and French Premier Édouard Daladier, to accept German demands regarding Sudetenland. The absence of Czech representatives in negotiations determining their nation's fate reflected the moral bankruptcy of a process sacrificing democratic allies to buy temporary peace with dictatorial adversaries. Peace for our time became the infamous phrase Chamberlain declared upon returning to London, waving a worthless document bearing Hitler's signature beside his own. Within 6 months, German troops would march into Prague, completing Czechoslovakia's destruction and reaffirming that appeasement only emboldened further aggression rather than satisfying it. The strategic ramifications were even more disastrous than the moral implications. As Hitler acquired the Škoda armaments works and industrial facilities, his military prowess grew significantly in anticipation of war, now appearing inevitable. British assurances to Poland in March 1939 represented a complete reversal of appeasement policy, but arrived too late to deter Hitler or enable adequate defenses against the next target of Nazi conquest. Chamberlain's commitment to defend Polish sovereignty sounded strong in Parliament, yet it lacked the necessary means for effective enforcement. British and French forces could do nothing to prevent a German invasion of Poland, except declare war post factum, leaving their new ally to face the Wehrmacht alone. Throughout the early weeks of what would evolve into World War, the second diplomatic activity escalated as all parties maneuvered for advantage in the imminent crisis. Stalin watched with cynical amusement while Britain and France half-heartedly courted Soviet support, hoping to avoid the revolutionary contagion association with communism. In parallel, Hitler prepared a masterstroke, a pact with Stalin that would eliminate the probability of a two-front war while allowing both dictators to dismember Poland. The Nazi-Soviet Pact, signed in Moscow on August 23, 1939, shocked the world by revealing that totalitarian foes could become transient allies when it benefited their mutual interests. Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop journeyed to the Soviet capital with Hitler's approval to offer Stalin territorial concessions previously thought unimaginable. The public non-aggression treaty bewildered observers, expecting these ideological opponents to maintain perpetual hostility. However, the secret protocol dividing Eastern Europe between German and Soviet spheres of influence represented a treacherous betrayal for the small nations caught between the two totalitarian regimes. Stalin's calculations were based on his belief that a war between Germany and Western democracies would deplete all potential adversaries while enhancing the Soviet Union's relative position by remaining neutral. As Hitler attacked Poland, he ensured that the conflict would begin as a European rather than a global war. The secret protocols promised him territory in Poland, the Baltic states, and Finland as compensation for neutrality, permitting him to advance Soviet borders westward without incurring the costs and risks of military conquest. On August 31, 1939, Hitler issued the final orders to unleash the most destructive war in human history. Directive Number 1 authorized the attack on Poland, set to commence at dawn the following day. Across the Reich, their armed units moved toward their assembly areas, while Luftwaffe squadrons prepared for bombing campaigns that would introduce the world to the terror of modern aerial warfare. At 4:45 a.m. on September 1, the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein, ostensibly on a courtesy visit to Danzig, opened fire on the Polish fortress of Westerplatte, igniting a conflict that would span 6 years and claim over 70 million lives. 21 years after the railway car ceremony concluding the war to end all wars, Europe was on the cusp of realizing that the peace settlement of 1919 had only provided a 20-year ceasefire between two acts of a cataclysmic drama. The rumblings resonating throughout the continent in the 1930s were about to culminate into a rapid and violent conflict that would forever alter the world. In the very forests of Poland, where the initial shots of the new conflict echoed, the darkest chapter in human history was about to unfold. The piercing dive of Junkers Ju-87 Stukas shattered the morning tranquility over Warsaw. September 1, 1939, witnessed the dawn of a novel kind of warfare, destined to terrify the globe. Bombs struck Polish airfields as defending pilots remained helpless on the ground, racing futilely toward their planes that burst into flames before they could reach the cockpits. This was Blitzkrieg, a lightning campaign combining tanks, aircraft, and rapid radio communication that would obliterate the static trench warfare of the previous generation, initiating a mobile apocalypse that outpaced human comprehension. General Heinz Guderian observed his panzer division sliced through Polish defenses as easily as steel knives through paper, vindicated at last in his theories of armored warfare dismissed earlier by conservative generals as reckless fantasy. His 19th Corps spearheaded the charge toward the Vistula River, illustrating how concentrated tank formations, supported by dive bombers, could achieve speeds that rendered traditional defensive strategies obsolete. Behind the advancing tanks, motorized infantry and artillery surged to exploit gaps, generating an operational tempo that left enemy commanders bewildered and struggling to comprehend the status of their once strong positions. Polish cavalry units, magnificent in tradition and courageous beyond measure, charged valiantly against the mechanical beasts, symbolizing the clash between two eras of warfare. At Kroj, the 18th Lancer Regiment galloped toward oncoming tanks with their sabers drawn, their horse hooves thundering against earth now destined to be soaked in blood. These desperate charges served only to demonstrate that isolated individual bravery could not surpass the systematic application of advanced industrial warfare. Within 18 days, the Polish army ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. The Luftwaffe had obliterated most of Poland's air force at the onset, while panzer spearheads shattered defensive lines before reserves could arrive for restoration. Most devastating of all was the psychological shock of confronting enemies who struck with unprecedented swiftness, leaving defenders feeling helpless against forces that anticipated their every move while remaining impervious to conventional countermeasures. Stalin's Eastern assault on September 17 delivered the final blow to the Polish resistance, extinguishing any lingering hopes of survival amidst this double assault. Red Army units surged across the border in overwhelming strength, occupying lands that the Nazi-Soviet pact had secretly allocated to Soviet influence. This synchronized betrayal by both totalitarian neighbors illustrated just how thoroughly the small nations of Eastern Europe had been abandoned by the democratic powers that had guaranteed their sovereignty merely months earlier. The last pockets of Polish resistance fell on October 6, marking the completion of a campaign that had introduced the world to the terrifying efficacy of modern mechanized warfare. Warsaw's ruins smoldered beneath skies darkened by smoke from burning buildings, as columns of imprisoned Polish soldiers marched toward an uncertain fate. The swiftness of this collapse shocked military analysts throughout Europe, compelling them to reevaluate fundamental beliefs regarding defensive strategies and the balance between offensive and protective tactics in contemporary engagements. Winter fell upon Europe, bringing an eerie calm that journalists dubbed the Phony War, as British and French armies remained entrenched behind the Maginot Line, while leaders hoped economic blockades might compel the Reich to negotiate, avoiding the gargantuan battles everyone feared. Despite commanding over 3 million Allied troops along the Western Front, General Maurice Gamelin made no decisive efforts to relieve pressure on Poland through diversionary attacks that might distract German forces. This indecisiveness reflected the defensive mindset dominating Allied strategic thought since 1918, when generals learned to dread the catastrophic costs of assaults against fortified positions. The Maginot Line, an engineering marvel of concrete and steel, seemed to ensure perfect protection against invasion, while enabling France to sidestep the massive casualties nearly annihilating her in the last war. Regrettably, this rigid approach overlooked the revolutionary developments in military technology that rendered such linear defenses increasingly worthless. Behind their fortifications, Allied soldiers whiled away winter months playing cards, writing letters, and speculating when they would at last confront real combat. Some optimists even hoped the Reich might collapse under its economic strain, sparing all from enduring another devastating European conflict. Such delusions reflected the democratic world's ongoing failure to recognize the revolutionary nature of the Nazi regime and its unwavering commitment to reshape Europe by conquest rather than negotiation. During this period of respite, the Führer concocted strategies demonstrating the constant evolution of blitzkrieg tactics, set to be applied against varying geographical and strategic contexts. The operation's forthcoming campaign in the West sought to establish whether the blitzkrieg methods, which had garnered such success in Poland, could replicate similar results against better prepared adversaries entrenched behind fortifications. With a shocking suddenness, spring arrived on April 9, 1940, as Operation Weserübung commenced simultaneous invasions of Denmark and Norway, catching the world off balance. Danish resistance crumbled within hours as airborne troops captured key airfields, while naval forces secured major ports before defenders could mount effective defense. The swiftness of this conquest emphasized how modern military technology had truncated the time frame for political decision-making, shifting international crises from diplomatic marathons to tactical sprints. Norway's challenging terrain offered improved defensive positions. Nevertheless, even these innovative German tactics overcame geographical benefits through coordinated application of air power and amphibious assault methods. Paratroopers descended from the sky to seize critical air bases in Oslo and Stavanger, while naval infantry stormed ashore at Narvik and various strategic ports. While Norwegian forces were brave and resourceful, they lacked the necessary equipment and coordination to oppose such multi-dimensional strikes executed with clockwork precision. British attempts to intervene in Norway highlighted the extent to which democratic military establishments lagged in adapting to the new realities of mechanized warfare. The hastily assembled expeditionary force that landed at several Norwegian ports lacked essential air support, artillery, and logistical capabilities for operations against foes who controlled both sea and sky. In mere weeks, these forces were expelled, foreshadowing the more famous retreat from Dunkirk that would follow a few months later. The Norwegian campaign culminated in total German control of crucial naval bases and iron ore supplies. demonstrating that geographical isolation could no longer promise security against adversaries possessing the technological means to project power over vast distances. Sweden's neutrality became irrelevant once German units could launch attacks from occupied Norwegian territory, while Britain's naval supremacy proved insufficient to prevent amphibious landings sustained by overwhelming air cover. May 10, 1940, dawned with the thunderous roar of 2,000 aircraft crossing the borders of Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg, as Fall Gelb unleashed the Western offensive that would determine Europe's fate. Paratroopers flew from the morning sky to capture essential bridges and fortifications, while glider-borne assault troops landed directly atop Belgium's supposedly impregnable fortifications. These vertical envelopment tactics accomplished total tactical surprise, capturing objectives that would have required weeks of siege operations to breach. Confidently dismissed by Allied commanders as unsuitable for large armored movements, rural forests became the arteries along which Panzer Corps advanced toward the Channel coast in the most decisive flanking maneuver since Hannibal's march on Rome. 7 armored divisions erupted from wooded hills like prehistoric creatures, their tracks churning narrow country lanes into rivers of mud while their cannon swept aside scattered French forces attempting to obstruct their onslaught. General Erwin Rommel piloted the 7th Panzer Division in a swift advance that earned him the moniker Desert Fox long before he stepped foot in Africa. His aggressive leadership, moving among threatened sectors to inspire troops and orchestrate attacks, exemplified the dynamic command style demanded by blitzkrieg tactics. Traditional generals, who sought control over mobile operations from far-off headquarters, frequently found themselves outmaneuvered by opponents who recognized that decisive speed in decision-making was as fundamental as firepower in determining battle outcomes. Allied commanders wrestled to grasp the pace of events, as their meticulously devised defensive strategies crumbled under the force of attacks that sprung from unexpected directions with overwhelming intensity. General Gamelin's strategy of moving into Belgium to counter the invasion collapsed when the primary assault manifested hundreds of kilometers further south, severing his armies from their bases and confining them within a pocket shrinkable by the hour. As events unfolded, Winston Churchill ascended to the prime ministerial office on May 10, coinciding with the initiation of the Western Offensive, inheriting a strategic dilemma that would have tested any leader's resilience. His initial address to Parliament acknowledged the dire circumstances confronting Britain, declaring that he had nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. These words encapsulated the essence of democratic persistence against totalitarian aggression, pledging an enduring struggle regardless of immediate tactical outcomes or strategic disadvantages. The breakthrough at Sedan on May 13 shattered French morale as thoroughly as it obliterated their defensive structures. Guderian's panzers crossed the Meuse River under the protection of concentrated Stuka raids that decimated defensive positioning, demoralizing soldiers who had never faced such intensity of aerial bombardment. Within hours, the German bridgehead expanded beyond the capacity of French reserves to manage, creating an irreversible gap in Allied lines. Belgian and Dutch resistance imploded with frightening speed as their armies found themselves trapped between advancing German forces, forced into the impossible dilemma of surrendering or risking the devastation of their historic cities. The bombing of Rotterdam on May 14 illustrated the Reich's readiness to unleash terror tactics against civilian centers, as the threat of similar fates compelled other urban centers to surrender rather than face annihilation from the skies. Scenes of French refugees congesting escape routes from advancing panzers created immense traffic jams, which obstructed military units from reaching strategic positions and offered ideal targets for Luftwaffe fighters. This pervasive atmosphere of civilian panic symbolized the social disintegration that accompanied military defeat, as entire populations discovered their governments could no longer deliver. the fundamental protection justifying their existence. The miracle of Dunkirk began on May 26, when Operation Dynamo launched a desperate attempt to evacuate the British Expeditionary Force from beaches boxed in by Guderian's advance toward the Channel shore. Lord Gort, commanding the stranded troops, recognized that continuing offensive operations had become untenable, and that evacuation offered the only alternative to utter surrender. Though strategically sound, his decision to retreat toward the coast ultimately abandoned French allies who had anticipated ongoing British support in their homeland's defense. An improvised armada of destroyers, fishing boats, pleasure vessels, and anything that could float traversed the Channel, ferrying weary soldiers to safety. While Luftwaffe bombers strove to sabotage the evacuation, RAF Fighter Command, stretched to its limits, provided protective air cover that hugely mitigated the potential disaster. This operation illustrated the critical importance of maintaining a degree of air superiority, even when retreating. The success of the evacuation, in saving 338,000 troops, represented both tactical success and strategic heartbreak, as while the soldiers were rescued, most of their equipment remained stranded on the shores, leaving Britain vulnerable to invasion, with only the Royal Navy and RAF fighters expected to soon face their greatest trial. Months would be needed to re-equip and retrain the soldiers before they could rejoin significant combat operations. On June 18, Charles de Gaulle's radio broadcast from London symbolized continuing French resistance, even as the Bordeaux government sought surrender terms. The general proclaimed, "France has lost a battle, not the war." This little-known figure, who had showcased the potential of armored warfare in brief offensives near Lorraine, established the Free French movement while rejecting the defeatism that paralyzed official French leadership. When Marshal Philippe Pétain signed the armistice on June 22, in the same railway car where Germany surrendered in 1918, this completion intensified the cycle of revenge that Hitler had envisioned during his days of blindness in a previous hospital. The symbolism of this ceremony, French representatives forced to sign terms in the identical location where their predecessors once dictated to defeated Germans, demonstrated how completely the European power balance had shifted in merely 6 weeks of blitzkrieg campaigning. The fall of France reflected more than just another military triumph. It symbolized the apparent dominance of authoritarian efficiency over deliberative democratic processes, of technological advancement over traditional methods, and of revolutionary fervor surpassing conservative caution worldwide. Observers were baffled by how a nation once considered Europe's predominant military presence could have collapsed so swiftly against foes many had derided as dangerous amateurs just months prior. As summer of 1940 dawned, Britain stood alone, shielded only by the narrow expanse of the English Channel, and the bravery of RAF pilots soon set to face the largest aerial offensive in history. The Luftwaffe had remained undefeated in sustained combat, while the Royal Navy, though formidable, could do little to avert invasion. If the Germans achieved air superiority over the Channel and landing sites, Hermann Göring's bombers began their siege of British airfields and radar stations in July, initiating the Battle of Britain that would determine whether the island could endure the United Steel hurricane that had already ravaged the remainder of Europe. Supermarine Spitfires and Hawker Hurricanes rose to meet formations of Heinkel-He 111s and Dornier Doe 17s, escorted by Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters, commencing an aerial campaign that would test both technological limits and the endurance of human spirit. The few, as Churchill dubbed the RAF pilots, burdened by this unequal conflict, confronted challenges that would be labeled impossible in prior wars. Fighter Command could barely muster 700 operational aircraft against a Luftwaffe flying more than 2,600 bombers and fighters. However, The British held advantages, partially counteracting this numerical deficiency. Radar early warning systems, providing essential tactical intelligence, proximity to bases, maximizing time over target, and crucially, the understanding that betrayal meant not only military defeat but national extinction. London's denizens endured the Blitz with unexpected stoicism, spending nights in underground stations while German bombers rained destruction upon their city with high explosives and incendiaries. The civilian response to this terror campaign showcased that democratic societies, when facing survival, could exhibit similar resolve and sacrifice as their totalitarian adversaries. Each dawn revealed new devastation, yet somehow daily life persisted. Shops reopened and workers returned amid the debris of their former communities. By October 1940, the Luftwaffe had failed to secure the air superiority necessary for Operation Sea Lion, the anticipated invasion of Britain. Fighter Command, despite being bloodied and fatigued, had thwarted the obliteration of RAF airfields and aircraft factories that would have facilitated invasion. This initial major defeat of the German armies affirmed that blitzkrieg tactics, while groundbreaking, were not inherently decisive against societies possessing sufficient defensive capabilities and the resolve to employ them effectively. With the arrival of autumn, the Führer's intentions shifted eastward as he was drawn by the vast territories and resources of the Soviet Union, which had consistently loomed large in his long-term strategic designs. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia, would dwarf all prior campaigns in scope and ambition while assessing whether blitzkrieg methods could yield conclusive results across the immense distances and harsh conditions of the Russian steppe. Soviet forces, despite having nearly 2 years to prepare for the onslaught, remained open to the tactical innovations proving lethal in Poland and France. Stalin's purges had decimated the ranks of experienced commanders, while his insistence on holding defensively along frontiers provided excellent targets for encirclement operations perfected by German generals during earlier campaigns. June 22, 1941, marked the start of the largest military operation in human history, as 3 million Axis soldiers breached the Soviet frontier along a plain spanning from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Army Group North targeted Leningrad, Army Group Center aimed for Moscow, and Army Group South advanced into Ukraine, each thrust supported by preponderant aerial power and guided by the same tactical precepts that had vanquished most of Europe. Initial encounters exceeded even the most optimistic expectations of the Germans, as entire Soviet armies found themselves ensnared in extensive encirclement near Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army troops surrendered, their materiel functioning efficiently for the advancing German forces. The magnitude of these victories suggested the Soviet Union might collapse as swiftly as France had just the previous year. By September, Leningrad was under siege, as Army Group North approached the metropolis that bore Lenin's name. The subsequent 900-day blockade tested endurance on both sides, while showcasing that even advanced military technology couldn't assure quick victory against opponents resolute enough to make any sacrifice for their homeland. The advance on Moscow faltered in the autumn mire, which arrived earlier than German planners had predicted. Their forces, having surged hundreds of kilometers in mere weeks, suddenly found themselves bogged down, struggling to forward supplies over primitive roads, turned into insurmountable quagmires. Troops who anticipated being home by Christmas instead encountered a Russian winter for which they had made no adequate arrangements. Soviet counterattacks initiated in December 1941 unveiled the Red Army's significant reserves and fighting strength despite the substantial casualties suffered in the opening phases. Fresh divisions shifted from Siberian strongholds encountered German spearheads dangerously overextended, compelling retreats that shattered the myth of their invincibility, while revealing that even blitzkrieg had operational constraints. As 1941 drew to a close, the tide of easy victories receded. The swift campaigns that had conquered much of Europe in under 2 years had finally met adversaries with both the necessary resources and the resolution for sustained resistance. The era of quick, decisive victories had begun to wane, yielding to an arduous battle of national endurance that would challenge every facet of military, economic, and social organization in forests surrounding Moscow, where the German forces first dug defensive positions since the campaign's commencement. The curtain was lifting on a vast, merciless chapter of the war. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the flagship Nagato in Hiroshima Bay, observing the strongest naval strike force ever assembled prepare for an operation capable of redrawing the global balance of power. 6 aircraft carriers, fitted with 353 bombers and fighters, lay anchored in the morning mist of November 26, 1941, as their crews made final preparations for a voyage crossing 3,000 miles of uninhabited Pacific waters to orchestrate an assault on America's naval heart. The architect of this bold maneuver understood that he was on the verge of awakening a slept giant capable of overwhelming his island nation with its industrial might. Yet circumstances left Japan little choice but to gamble for a quick victory. For 4 years, the Japanese Empire was enmeshed in a sprawling conflict with China that devoured vast resources without yielding decisive gains. The Marco Polo Bridge incident of July 1937 evolved from a minor engagement between Japanese and Chinese troops into an all-out invasion involving millions of soldiers in substantial battles spanning from Manchuria to Canton. Emperor Hirohito's forces captured Beijing, Shanghai, and Nanjing, however. Chinese resistance persisted under Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government and Mao Zedong's communist factions, both preferring to confront foreign invaders rather than each other. President Franklin Roosevelt observed these developments with rising worry, recognizing that Japan's expansion threatened not only Chinese sovereignty, but also the entire framework of international law and collective security that America hoped could prevent another global catastrophe. The Panay incident of December 1937, during which Japanese aircraft intentionally attacked an American gunboat on the Yangtze River, illustrated Tokyo's willingness to directly challenge Western interests, testing whether the United States possessed the resolve to defend its principles and citizens in distant waters. American economic pressure sharply increased throughout 1940 and 1941 as Roosevelt's administration initiated a series of trade restrictions intended to compel Japan's withdrawal from China without resorting to military conflict. The Export Control Act authorized limits on strategic materials, while the freezing of Japanese assets in July 1941 effectively severed regular trade relations between the countries. The most devastating measure was the oil embargo that deprived Japan of petroleum supplies vital for both military actions and civilian economic activities. General Hideki Tojo, who rose to the premiership in October 1941, embodied the military faction considering further negotiations both futile and dishonorable. His elevation reflected a Japanese leadership's perspective that their empire faced a stark choice: yield to American demands or desperately attempt to seize resources through military conquest. The decision effectively occurred when prior diplomatic efforts failed to resolve the fundamental contradictions between Japanese expansion and American principles. Secret negotiations continued even as both sides readied for hostilities, with Ambassador Kiichi Saburo Nomura meeting routinely with Secretary of State Cordell Hull in Washington. As Yamamoto's fleet headed toward their target, these discussions primarily preserved the semblance of peaceful intentions, while military preparations reached their final phases. Hull's note on November 26, which demanded Japanese withdrawal from China and Indochina, was seen in Tokyo as an ultimatum that no Japanese government could accept without sacrificing all credibility with its citizens. The Pearl Harbor Strike Force took a northern route across the Pacific to avoid commercial shipping lanes while maintaining radio silence to minimize detection by American intelligence. Task Force commanders meticulously studied every facet of the Hawaiian naval base through intelligence gathered from diplomatic sources and tourists, creating target folders, pinpointing the locations of fuel tanks, ammunition depots, and the battleships that anchored the Pacific Fleet's strength. December 7, 1941, dawned clear and calm over Oahu as American personnel began what they expected to be another routine Sunday in a region regarded as peaceful. Radar operators tracked approaching aircraft formations at 7:02 a.m., but their warnings elicited dismissal from duty officers who believed they marked the arrival of expected B-17 Flying Fortresses from California. This failure to communicate epitomized the peacetime mindset that had rendered American military forces unprepared for the revolutionary carrier-based air attacks propelled beyond visual sight. At 7:55 a.m., Commander Mitsuo Fujita led the first wave of 183 aircraft across Pearl Harbor's anchorages, reporting Tora, 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 Tora to indicate complete tactical surprise. A group of dive bombers screeched down upon Battleship Row, while torpedo bombers skimmed the surface at masthead height, unleashing their weapons with devastating accuracy. In mere minutes, the USS Arizona erupted in flames, claiming 1177 sailors, while the USS Oklahoma capsized following numerous torpedo strikes. The second wave arrived at 8:54 a.m., finishing the wreckage of American air power by targeting installations that had survived the initial onslaught. Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, and Kaneohe Naval Air Station became firestorms as Japanese fighters strafed parked aircraft that presented perfect targets for pilots well trained for such an engagement. By the time the last attackers left at 9:45 a.m., they had sunk or damaged 18 warships, destroyed 188 planes, and killed 2,403 Americans. Admiral Husband Kimmel, the Pacific Fleet's commander, watched his forces engulfed in flames, grappling to comprehend the magnitude of disaster that had struck. His 8 battleships, symbols of American naval supremacy in the Pacific, had been decimated. Some were sunk, while others suffered irreparable damage. However, the Japanese had overlooked the most vital targets of the aircraft carriers, all of which remained at sea during the attack, while the fuel storage and repair infrastructure, essential for rapid recovery, remained intact. Roosevelt's address to Congress on December 8 transformed American public sentiment overnight, unifying a previously divided populace behind a call for total defeat against enemies that began hostilities unprovoked. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the President declared, articulating the moral outrage that would propel American determination during the harrowing months ahead. Within hours, Congress declared a state of war with Japan, an action reflecting the total collapse of isolationist sentiment. The strategic miscalculation behind the Pearl Harbor attack gradually emerged, as Yamamoto's apprehensions about igniting American industrial capabilities proved prophetic. Although the tactical victory for Japan was comprehensive, erasing American battleship strength in the Pacific, the raid furnished Roosevelt with the political justification for complete engagement in the global struggle against fascism. A populace that had previously resisted entering foreign conflicts now demanded retaliation against adversaries striking without warning or declaration. Japanese expansion throughout the Pacific and Southeast Asia progressed with remarkable speed, matching the Blitzkrieg campaigns seen earlier in Europe. General Tomoyuki Yamashita launched the 25th Army's invasion of Malaya on December 8, advancing down the peninsula with bicycle troops and light tanks that outpaced British defenders' efforts to mount a coherent defense. The supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore capitulated on February 15, 1942, surrendering 80,000 troops in what Churchill dubbed the most significant disaster and largest capitulation in British history. Lieutenant General Masaharu Hama's 14th Army landed in the Philippines on December 22, forcing General Douglas MacArthur's combined American and Filipino forces into a retreat toward the Bataan Peninsula, where they would fight a desperate battle for months. MacArthur's evacuation to Australia in March, though strategically necessary, left his troops feeling forsaken as they confronted overwhelming odds without hope for reinforcement or resupply. The subsequent Bataan Death March exemplified the Japanese military culture's harsh disregard for prisoners, violating the warrior code by opting for surrender over death. Hong Kong's garrison fell after 18 days of hopeless resistance, while Dutch forces in the East Indies shattered under the weight of coordinated air, sea, and land assaults that overwhelmed their disparate defensive positions. The rapid pace of these conquests illustrated meticulous Japanese planning and the advantages of interior lines, facilitating rapid concentrations of force against isolated garrisons unable to receive mutual support across the vast distances of the Pacific theater. The conquest of Burma opened access to India while severing the Burma Road, which remained China's last reputable supply line connecting to the outside world. British forces under General William Slim enacted a fighting retreat through hundreds of miles of jungle terrain, showcasing the tactical aptitude that would later empower their recovery. But even with this skill, they could not prevent the loss of essential strategic territory. The fall of Rangoon eradicated the main port through which supplies had flowed to the Chinese forces, necessitating reliance on the far more challenging aerial route over the Himalayas. As Admiral Chester Nimitz assumed command of the Pacific Fleet amid the devastation of Pearl Harbor, he faced a strategic dilemma testing any commander's capabilities. The loss of battleship strength dictated a reliance on aircraft carriers that many naval traditionalists still considered auxiliary vessels. However, this apparent deficiency would later prove advantageous as aviation emerged as the pivotal component of Pacific naval maneuvers. Carrier task forces under admirals such as William Bill Halsey began executing hit-and-run strikes against Japanese installations throughout the Central Pacific, showcasing that American naval potency still retained potent offensive capabilities. Despite the losses at Pearl Harbor, these missions yielded vital learning experiences in carrier aviation while bolstering civilian morale through evidence that the United States could retaliate against adversaries once thought invulnerable. During early expansion, the Doolittle raid on April 18, 1942, encapsulated this aggressive spirit with 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers launching from the carrier USS Hornet to strike targets in Japan itself. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle's volunteers executed missions effectively functioning as one-way operations, crash landing in China after dropping ordnance on Tokyo, Yokohama, Kobe, and Nagoya. The material damage sustained was negligible, yet the psychological effect was substantial, exposing Japan's home islands to attack and compelling all resources to be channeled toward expanded domestic defense. The strategic coordination within the Grand Alliance started to emerge as Churchill and Roosevelt convened with their military staffs to establish priorities for the global conflict ahead. The recognition that Nazi industrial and scientific resources posed a more significant long-term threat informed the decision to prioritize a strategy of Germany first, while recognizing that Japanese expansion was fundamentally constrained by geographic limitations and scarce resources. This determination would shape Allied strategy throughout the war, ensuring that the European theater received a preeminent allocation of resources and manpower. Despite setbacks in the Pacific, Soviet resistance on the Eastern Front thwarted the Wehrmacht's pursuit of rapid decisive victory, preventing Axis resources from being freed for other theaters and leading to a three-front global conflict that extended Axis capabilities past their breaking point. Stalin's pleas for a second front in Europe could not be met immediately. Yet, American Lend-Lease aid began flowing to the Soviet Union in critical quantities that would prove vital for sustaining defense during the direst moments of the German advance. The Battle of the Atlantic intensified as German U-boats exploited American unpreparedness to commence Operation Drumbeat against shipping along the eastern seaboard. Admiral Karl Donitz's submarines identified merchant vessels silhouetted against coastal city lights where local authorities had yet to implement blackout procedures, sinking trader vessels within sight of shores still bustling with tourists. These second Happy Times attacks revealed how quickly the conflict had transformed into a truly global war, wreaking havoc on American shores. Just weeks post-Pearl Harbor, convoy systems previously effective in securing British shipping were extended to American coastal regions as the Liberty Ship Construction Program launched, producing merchant vessels increasingly faster than submarines could sink them. The arsenal of democracy Roosevelt had promised was beginning its function, although several months would pass prior to American production reaching the levels necessary to execute simultaneous offensives across multiple theaters. By summer 1942, the Axis reached its greatest territorial extent, controlling an empire stretching from the Atlantic coast of France to the islands of the Central Pacific, from the Arctic Ocean to the Sahara Desert. Yet this seeming triumph masked fundamental vulnerabilities that would soon become apparent as the Allies regrouped from initial setbacks and coordinated vast resources for protracted large-scale campaigns. The tide of easy victories was receding, supplanted by grueling contests testing national strength and determination. In the coral atolls of the Central Pacific, where Admiral Nimitz prepared to confront Japanese naval dominance, the early indicators of this transformation were already surfacing. The slumbering giant was awakening, with its industrial core lying far beyond reach of any adversary's assault. Amid the wreckage of initial defeat, a new battle emerged, one that would determine if free peoples could redirect history away from the looming shadow of dictatorship. Rifle fire crackled while artillery roared through the derelict streets of Stalingrad, as in August 1942, the deadliest urban conflict in history erupted. General Friedrich Paulus led his Sixth Army into a city that carried Stalin's name, confident this new target would yield as quickly as the scores of Soviet cities that had already succumbed to their precise military efficiency. Instead, the 250,000 men found themselves ensnared in a nightmarish close-quarters battle, where survival was quantified in hours and territorial gains measured in meters, not kilometers. Vasily Zaitsev crouched behind the crumbling concrete of a factory wall, his rifle scope focused on a distant helmet potentially concealing a German sniper, traversing the skeletal remains of what were once apartment complexes. The famous marksman of the Red Army had secured over 200 enemy kills in this urban calamity, where death lurked in every window and despair cloaked the basements. Stalin's Order No. 227 declared not one step back, transforming retreat from a tactical option to a capital offense, ensuring Soviet soldiers would fight as if their survival hinged solely on their victory. Political commissars enforced this edict with summary executions, engendering a reign of terror behind the front lines to mirror the unfolding chaos in Stalingrad's tormented districts. The message was unmistakable. Death awaited those who fled the enemy, but it certainly awaited those who retreated. Nikita Khrushchev served as Stalin's direct representative in the beleaguered city, facilitating reinforcements traveling across the Volga River and assuring military commanders recognized the political ramifications of failure. His presence embodied the regime's unwavering dedication to hold this pivotal prize, irrespective of expense, turning a tactical engagement into a test of wills between two states that could offer no signs of feebleness to their observing empires. The 62nd Army, led by General Vasily Chuikov, became the backbone of resistance, establishing defensive positions in the grain elevator, the railway station, and the tractor factory. Sites destined to change hands countless times either side fed troops into the urban carnage. Chukov's headquarters continually shifted to avoid shelling, sometimes operating mere hundreds of meters from enemy lines while coordinating the complex logistics of urban warfare. Soviet reinforcements crossed the Volga under the cover of night, braving artillery fire and airstrikes that transformed each supply run into a perilous gamble. These night crossings delivered not only personnel and ammunition but also vital equipment tailored for urban combat. Flamethrowers, grenades, and submachine guns that proved decisive in scuffles where opponents could potentially be separated by a single wall. The German toll mounted with each ensuing week, as they grappled with the realization that conventional military doctrine offered limited guidance for subduing a city defended by troops committing to fight to the death rather than surrender. The Luftwaffe's air support, effective in open terrain, appeared largely nonplussed against concealed targets nestled in underground shelters and tunnel systems. Artillery bombardments, once capable of shattering enemy formations, frequently merely provided increased hiding spots for defenders determined to fight from the ruins of their own positions. By September, Marshal Georgy Zhukov arrived at the Moscow headquarters, prepared to initiate a counteroffensive destined to convert this defensive struggle into a pivotal moment on the Eastern Front. Operation Uranus would strike the weakest points within the Axis line, targeting Romanian and Italian forces, securing the Reich's flanks, while Wehrmacht remained preoccupied with occupying the city that had become an obsession rather than a sensible military objective. November 19, 1942, heralded the day that changed everything, as Soviet artillery opened fire across an extensive front stretching for hundreds of kilometers north and south of the besieged city. The Third and Fourth Romanian armies, ill-equipped and lacking the fervor of their Axis counterparts, swiftly succumbed to massive tank advances supported by superior aerial power. As of November 23, the pincers closed, encircling Paulus and his entire army in a pocket that dwindled more each day. The role reversal was complete. Hunters had become the hunted. The besiegers transformed into the besieged. Units that had progressed 1,000 km from their starting points found themselves encircled in the very ruins they had created, reliant on air supply through a corridor, controlled by enemies who had adeptly coordinated their anti-aircraft defenses. Erman Göring's assurances to supply the encircled forces via air transport proved as hollow as most Luftwaffe claims. During this period, air transport faced insurmountable challenges. Pilots attempting to reach encircled German units required 750 tons of supplies daily to sustain minimum efficiency. Yet, improvised operations only managed a fraction, barely reaching a quarter of that amount even on optimal days, while suffering heavy losses with each bomber succumbing to Soviet fighters and flak batteries that converted supply missions into one-way trips for numerous indispensable crews and aircraft. By Christmas 1942, the once mighty Sixth Army resorted to consuming horses, dogs, and ultimately their leather boots, struggling amid starvation, frostbite, and enemy fire, as their forces withered. Soldiers who had overrun most of Europe now perished of hunger in basements where temperatures fell far below zero, their frozen bodies serving as markers in a hellscape that mocked previously held beliefs regarding technological warfare's ability to transcend human endurance. General Erich von Manstein's relief efforts, launched in December, deploying the most capable armored units available on the Eastern Front, approached tantalizingly close to breaking through the Soviet encirclement before ceasing just 50 km from the surrounded army. Paulus received orders to break out and unite with the relief force, yet his forces lacked the fuel, ammunition, and fighting strength necessary for such an operation. The opportunity for salvation slipped away, leaving the trapped garrison to confront its fate alone. Surrender occurred on February 2, 1943, when Paulus emerged from his bunker to formally capitulate. Rather than obey his Führer's commands to fight to the last ounce of strength, fewer than 90,000 of the 330,000 Axis soldiers who entered the Stalingrad pocket survived to start the journey to Siberian captivity, from which most would never return. The myth of their invincibility evaporated in those frigid ruins, replaced by the reality proving that superior numbers, industrial capacity, and strategic depth could surpass tactical excellence when maintained over sufficient time and distance. 4,000 kilometers southwest, General Bernard Montgomery readied his Eighth Army for an offensive that would obliterate Axis power in North Africa and pave the way toward Hitler's European bastion. The Second Battle of El Alamein would test whether British forces had absorbed lessons from prior defeats, while showcasing the increasing effectiveness of Allied coordination between ground and naval forces. The Afrika Korps, under Erwin Rommel, had advanced within 60 miles of Alexandria by summer 1942, threatening the Suez Canal and the oil resources crucial to Britain's strategic standing in the Mediterranean and Middle East. Rommel's tactical genius had made him a legend in both armies. However, prolonged supply lines and dwindling resources created vulnerabilities Montgomery aimed to exploit through meticulous preparation and overwhelming material superiority. Interventions from Churchill into Desert Command led to Montgomery being instructed to avoid retreats, improvisational defenses, and tactical defeats that squandered strategic opportunities. Montgomery's approach emphasized careful planning and a focus on numerical superiority before initiating attacks, a reflection of lessons learned through 3 years of costly encounters with German tactical effectiveness. Operation Lightfoot began on October 23, 1942, with an artillery barrage involving 1,000 guns, shattering the night from the Mediterranean coast to the Katara Depression. Montgomery's plan prioritized attrition rather than maneuver, grinding forward through Axis defensive positions with steady advances that exchanged time for casualties while safeguarding armored reserves to prosecute breakthroughs. The Desert Air Force, now boasting numerical superiority for the first time in North Africa, provided close support that neutralized Luftwaffe capabilities, while interdicting supply convoys struggling to reach Rommel's forces via the Mediterranean. The Air Force had already diminished Axis logistics to a trickle, compelling the Afrika Korps to fight with dwindling fuel and ammunition reserves that rendered sustained resistance impossible. Rommel's counterattacks illustrated the tactical brilliance that had formed his reputation. Yet each engagement consumed irreplaceable resources while British strength continued to grow through supplies reaching their destination via safer routes. The mathematics of attrition favored Montgomery, who could afford to exchange manpower for terrain, while his opponent faced impending shortages proving ultimately decisive. On November 4, 1942, the breakthrough Montgomery had meticulously planned unfolded as Operation Supercharge finally broke Axis defenses, forcing Rommel to commence the lengthy retreat that wouldn't conclude until his forces reached Tunisia. The pursuit illustrating this complete transformation in the balance of forces in North Africa displayed British armored divisions advancing hundreds of kilometers, while their opponents struggled to establish any consistent protective line. Operation Torch landed 3 Allied armies on November 8 in Morocco and Algeria, inaugurating the Second Front in North Africa that would catch Axis forces between converging offensives while providing invaluable experience in amphibious operations for the planned European invasion. General Dwight Eisenhower directed this intricate multinational operation, laying the groundwork for coalition warfare skills crucial for future campaigns toward success. American forces, under General George Patton, swiftly seized Morocco with characteristic speed and aggressiveness, while British units landed near Algiers to initiate their advance toward Tunisia. The coordination required for these concurrent assaults over such vast distances exemplified the increasing sophistication of Allied planning while offering practical experience in global warfare logistics. Vichy French forces presented varied levels of resistance. Before Admiral François Darlan's controversial agreement culminated in most fighting and opening of ports and airfields in support of Allied forces. While this political arrangement attracted criticism for compromising with fascist collaborators, it yielded immediate strategic advantages, significantly accelerating the campaign's progress while illustrating the complex ethical compromises global conflict necessitated for democratic leaders distant from the front lines. Meanwhile, Admiral Nimitz prepared for the critical naval engagement, determining whether Japanese advances could be halted before the Axis empire expanded beyond reach for successful Allied assaults. The Battle of Midway would gauge revolutionary concepts in carrier aviation against an adversary that had perfected these strategies throughout their stunning victories over the preceding 6 months. Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sought to orchestrate a decisive confrontation capable of eradicating the remaining American carrier strength, carefully planning to engage before industrial production could replenish losses endured at Pearl Harbor. His intricate strategy involved diversionary strikes against the Aleutian Islands while launching a main force toward Midway Atoll, anticipating a chance to surprise American forces and dismantle Pacific Fleet capacities conclusively. Intelligence from American codebreakers offered Nimitz groundbreaking insights into enemy intentions, allowing for defensive preparations that would nullify Japanese advantages regarding numbers and military experience. Commander Joseph Rochefort's team had decrypted substantial elements of Japanese naval codes, revealing not only the target but also the timing and composition of the attacking fleet, yielding the kind of strategic awareness commanders had often dreamed of possessing throughout history. Task Force 16, under Admiral Raymond Spruance, and Task Force 17, led by Admiral Frank Fletcher, constituted the remaining robust American maritime forces in the Pacific, with the knowledge that defeat would leave America vulnerable to Japan's next move while obliterating their ability to conduct offensives for months or years ahead. The stakes for a nation still reeling from prior calamities post-Pearl Harbor could not have grown more dire. On June 4, 1942, Japanese carriers initiated the first assault against Midway installations, while American planes searched the expansive ocean for targets that remained beyond visual perception. The revolution in naval warfare represented by these carriers was soon about to be tested in the initial engagement involving two fleets that never physically confronted one another, except through the perspectives of their respective air crews. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led his dive bombers through broken cloud cover towards the Japanese fleet, striking during a vulnerable moment when enemy fighters had lowered their altitudes after repelling largely unsuccessful torpedo attacks. The subsequent 5 minutes would redefine the Pacific War's trajectory as American SPD Dauntless bombers descended upon flight decks laden with fuel and munitions. The Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu erupted in flames visible from miles away as bombs penetrated wooden flight decks and ignited aviation fuel and ammunition that constituted carriers' strengths, yet also vulnerabilities. Within hours, 3 of the 4 carriers involved in the Pearl Harbor attack sank beneath the ocean swells, taking with them irreplaceable airmen who had endowed Japanese naval aviation with its decisive edge. During these initial months of expansion, the last Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, managed to launch a desperate counteroffensive, wounding the USS Yorktown before surrendering to American dive bombers. The subsequent exchange, where Japan lost 4 carriers for only 1 American aircraft, represented a dramatic strategic disaster for an empire unable to replenish such losses, while now contending with foes whose manufacturing abilities were just commencing their full potential. The broader strategic consequences of Midway extended beyond its immediate tactical repercussions, signifying the cessation of Japanese offensive operations and foreshadowing an American advance that would continue without major setbacks, leading to victory just 3 years later. Yamamoto's endeavors to impose a decisive engagement had paradoxically proved so, but not in the manner he had anticipated. Guadalcanal became the crucible where these strategic shifts would be affirmed through 6 months of arduous combat that showcased American resoluteness, willing to embrace casualties while maintaining their offensive initiative. The landing of Marines on August 7, 1942, marked the inception of the first major Allied ground operation against Japanese positions, signaling a campaign that would vindicate the industrial and demographic advantages revealed at Midway. Strategic bombing campaigns over the Rhine escalated during 1942 and 1943, with RAF Bomber Command and the U.S. 8th Air Force initiating systematic strikes on industrial targets, assessing whether air power alone could yield decisive outcomes. The Thousand-Bomber Raid against Cologne in May 1942 exemplified the scope Allied air operations were beginning to reach, while the oil raids of August 1943 reflected the commitment to sustaining heavy losses in pursuit of strategic goals. These bombing missions prompted a massive diversion of resources toward the defense of homeland territories, debilitating other fronts while inflicting the same terror that Axis forces had unleashed on their adversaries. The moral implications surrounding area bombing would be subjects of debate long after the war's conclusion, yet this immediate strategic impact was indisputable in its effectiveness at disrupting enemy production networks and morale. Resistance movements across occupied Europe gained vigor and coordination as the tide of battle turned, evolving from isolated acts of sabotage into organized campaigns that anchored substantial Axis forces while providing intelligence for the planned Allied invasions. By early 1943, strategic initiative shifted to the Allies in every major front, except for the Atlantic arena, where UBOAT campaigns continued to jeopardize supply routes sustaining the resistance. Yet even their novel technologies and tactics sought to tilt the balance, setting the stage for significant offensives that would shift the conflict into its concluding phases, as shadows of Axis supremacy began to wane, making way for harsh campaigns that would ultimately determine which side could summon deeper resolve and greater strength. As darkness clung to the early hours of July 10, 1943, the sky over Sicily trembled under the weight of 2000 aircraft, culminating in an expansive airborne offensive like none other. Gliders carrying British and American paratroopers severed their tow cables over the Mediterranean as transport planes prepared to offload human cargo onto landing zones depicted in intelligence reports to be lightly defended. General Montgomery's 8th Army and General Patton's 7th Army were about to orchestrate Operation Husky, the campaign that would breach Hitler's fortress Europe and spur the continent's liberation from fascist tyranny. Major General James Gavin leaped with his 82nd Airborne Division into the chaotic night above Sicily, landing far from his intended drop zone amidst olive groves, where scattered paratroopers wrestled to regroup in darkness. The airborne offensive, intended to secure essential objectives ahead of beach landings, devolved into an entangled nightmare of dispersed troops, lost equipment, and communication failures, threatening the entire operation's success before it secured proper footing. Despite early setbacks, Allied forces stormed ashore at dawn, across shores stretched from Syracuse to Licata, confronting resistance varying between fierce tenacity and immediate surrender, based on whether they engaged experienced German units or demoralized Italian coastal divisions. The overall diversity in enemy response exposed significant rifts forming within the Axis alliance, as Mussolini's forces exhibited escalating reluctance to perish for their allies' imperial ambitions. The naval dominance of the Royal Navy assured overwhelming fire support that decimated coastal fortifications while ensuring total control over the surrounding waters. This superiority had been achieved through 3 years of savage conflicts, enabling an amphibious operation scale inconceivable during the grim times of 1940 and 1941. Messina became the coveted prize both Allied armies raced to capture. As Montgomery methodically advanced up the eastern coast, Patton's dynamic drive through the island's mountainous terrain fostered competition between their two commands, reflecting the competitive spirit driving Allied forces to exceed their optimistically planned assumptions. Resistance crumbled at an astonishing pace as Italian forces surrendered en masse, while their leaders sought accommodation with invaders who offered preferable prospects than an increasingly demanding partnership with Axis powers. The psychological implications of engaging on European soil for the first time since 1940 invigorated Allied troops while demonstrating to the populations across occupied Europe that liberation was not merely a distant dream but an imminent reality. On July 25, 1943, King Victor Emmanuel III dismissed Mussolini, signaling the end of the fascist regime that had governed Italy for over 2 decades and sending tremors throughout the Axis coalition. The architect of fascism found himself in custody, his grand visions of a new Roman Empire reduced to the bleak reality of military defeat and public rejection. This dramatic shift illustrated the remarkable speed at which authoritarian governments could fail once their aura of invincibility was dismantled by military defeat. Marshal Pietro Badoglio's new administration promptly engaged in confidential discussions with the Allies, while navigating the challenges of maintaining an appearance of allegiance to fascist solidarity, to prevent their marked occupation of the peninsula. On September 8, 1943, news of Italy's surrender emerged, transforming erstwhile enemies into tacit companions while creating new obstacles for Allied commanders facing the dual threat of advancing through a country whose legally valid government welcomed them but whose territory remained occupied by proactive foes. The contradiction between political cooperation and military resistance would characterize the Italian campaign for the duration of the conflict. The Axis forces under Field Marshal Albert Kesselring anticipated Italian betrayal and moved swiftly to secure strategic positions throughout the peninsula, converting territory previously held by their former allies into a series of defensive lines destined to challenge Allied capabilities for the subsequent 20 months. The rescue of Mussolini by Otto Skorzeny, whose commandos illustrated the Reich's commitment to maintaining appearances of Axis solidarity, while reinstating the puppet Italian Social Republic in the north, further intensified the complexities of military maneuvers. Allied landings at Salerno on September 9, 1943, encountered intense opposition as Kesselring's forces endeavored to drive the invaders back to sea before they could establish secure footholds. The battle for the landing zones devolved into a desperate conflict that avoided complete failure only due to timely naval gunfire and aerial support allowing greater numbers to withstand fierce counterattacks. Monte Cassino became emblematic of frustrations during the Italian campaigns, as Allied forces spent months trying to breach defensive fortifications that dominated approaches to Rome. The ancient monastery, located atop a perching height, was reduced to rubble by Allied artillery and bombing, yet German troops still defended it with fanaticism, inflicting heavy casualties upon the attacking forces. 4 attempts failed to dislodge these defenders who had fashioned every stone into a fortress, with every crater morphing into a machine gun position. Finally, in May 1944, the Polish Second Corps seized the heights, but at an enormous cost, with the strategic merits remaining in doubt considering the time and resources exhausted upon prolonged sieges. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Red Army launched efforts dwarfing the breadth of the Italian campaign regarding scale and strategic importance. The end of the Leningrad siege, starting in January 1944, concluded 872 harrowing days of suffering that took over 1 million civilian lives, while showcasing Soviet endurance in the face of conditions that would have fractured less resolute societies. Marshal Leonid Govorov of the Leningrad Front and Marshal Kirill Meretskov of the Volkhov Front coordinated assaults that shattered Army Group North's siege lines, finally re-establishing land links to the city that had become a beacon of resistance throughout the Soviet Union. The lift of the Leningrad siege symbolized more than mere operational defeat. It affirmed that no stronghold was unassailable when tasked with sufficiently resourceful and determined adversaries. Operation Bagration began on June 23, 1944. Illustrating the Red Army's transformation into the world's most potent ground force. 3 million Soviet troops attacked along an expansive front, stretching from the Baltic to the prepared marshes, commemorating the third anniversary of Operation Barbarossa, by annihilating Army Group Center to the extent that their organized combat capacity effectively ceased. Marshal Ivan Bagramian of the First Baltic Front and Marshal Ivan Chernyakhovsky of the Third Belarusian Front achieved breakthrough speeds that exceeded even the most successful blitzkrieg operations of 1940 and 1941. Soviet tank formations advanced over 400 kilometers in just 2 weeks, encircling entire divisions while capturing equipment and prisoners in numbers that illustrated how decisively the balance of forces had shifted on the Eastern Front. Minsk fell on July 3, followed by Vilnius and Brest-Litovsk, with each capture signifying a milestone in the forward movement that would carry Soviet units to the gates of Warsaw. By summer's close, the rapid pace of this offensive astounded even Stalin, accustomed to remarkable victories yet unprepared for how decisively his forces could prevail against opponents who still retained considerable strength and resources.